back to the Tavern Between Dimensions, a monthly tabletop RPG podcast. We now sit around the table and join the Players Round, where we discuss things that affect the players. The topic I kind of wanted to bring up today is, I think it's a big one, and it's one that we all do. You know, it kind of sometimes happens a lot in the background, and that's basically how do we make our characters like each other, or how do we find those friendships or rivalries? How do we forge relationships with our characters in D&D, and at what stage do we forge them?
I mean, Chris and I, in Wild Beyond the Witchlight, our two characters are Witchlight hands. So we had a discussion before everything kicked off to say, you know, we're roommates. We're trailer mates. Like, what history has there been between our characters? What is the style of relationship between our characters? Like, what the stuff that we can figure out with and agree upon now will just kind of enrich what comes later, right? Like, we both have this kind of mutual basis to work on, and we've ended up with this kind of very curious Pinky in the Brain type relationship, haven't we? Yeah.
I'm really enjoying it.
I won't ask who is who.
Yeah, I was going to say, can people guess who is who?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a love to hate to love kind of dynamic that we have going on. Yeah, this kind of dysfunctional roommates that have been thrust into this weird and wonderful world, and like just their wildly opposing worldviews, I feel is really kind of coming out to the front now we're playing. But yeah, I would argue, just in that sense, kind of being open with the other players and the games master about the things that you'd like other players to relate to in terms of your character. So for Sprock and Gil, it was the fact that they had the same job, and then also be ready to realize that bear in mind it's a two-way street, right? Like, so if you're asking people to cater for your character, you got to cater for theirs as well.
I think a lot of it probably does come down in that session 0 as well, doesn't it? Because this is where you sort of like see those points as everyone's designing the characters around you, where you can sort of home in on that one person and be like, you're playing the lawful good paladin. Well, I'm playing the chaotic neutral rogue. Do you want to play something there? Or, you find maybe someone has a similar background to you, so you can then latch into that one. I guess it does mean that session 0, it's about that paying attention, as we've mentioned in the past, table etiquette, like having that table etiquette at session 0 to listen to what's going on around the table, should you be able to pick up on those possible relationship links.
Well, I mean, in the previous segment, we were talking about the Powered by the Apocalypse game, and despite the fact that most of the people that were playing didn't really know each other, but by the end of it, everyone had just kind of seamlessly come together through just this kind of mutual understanding of their characters. It's just a powerful tool, and the more that you're able to genuinely care about other people's characters, the more invested you're going to be in it. Because at the end of the day, like, sure, you may really, really like your character, but your character is 15% of the puzzle when you factor in everyone else's characters as well.
I quite like when GMs ask me a question about another character and I know nothing about them. So in certain TTRPGs, you'll get asked, for example, again, going back to our previous section, was with Butter Princess, you get asked how the player to your left vexed you on the bus on the way in. So you get to immediately create this tension between you and another player.
Yes.
And whatever you say is correct, because they then pass it on to the next person and the next person and the next person, and the person at the end comes back to you. So everybody has some sort of dynamic already, and just asking that question is so important.
I find that the important moment for when you're trying to create a relation with the character is having a scene with them. Like in combat as a group, you're not really highlighting the relationship, but if you can find that little moment where you can have that spotlight, have that scene one-on-one with another character, I find that creates growth in the dynamic, in the relationship. I don't know if you've had that with other characters or other settings.
I mean, in the Cormier campaign, there's been quite a few points where, like, you lot of players have effectively reached out to one of the other players and said,
yeah.
I want to role play with your
scene.
character about that thing, like that attribute of yours or something like that. It's very rarely a case of I want to do some role play with you because I want to be in the spotlight. Yeah, it's that kind of selflessness that kind of brings a character's life. I mean, if we were to look at, say, the Lord of the Rings films, the relationship between Legolas and Gimli, I think one of the most powerful moments is when Legolas asks Gimli if he needs a box to stand on. Like, that's before the Battle of Helm's Deep, like one of the most exciting bits of that trilogy, right? But it's that little interaction beforehand that really kind of solidifies the relationship that carries on from that point. Yeah, and it's also just good practice, right? Like, as a player, reaching out to invite other players to speak is just a good way of sharing the attention and the fun.
But how do you select like which character you want to go out to? There must be some sort of affinity there, right? That your character has, or that you have as a player have with that character.
Well, if I think back to the 4th edition campaign, I think there was a player that came to me about this and sort of wanted to forge a closer sort of relationship with my character because they'd become more interested in things they were doing, and in game they were starting to ask more questions. They were trying to be more engaging with my character because in their head, or at least in their in character lore, was that person had seen my character do something quite exceptional, and it sort of triggered that point in the back of the head, like, oh, maybe they're not as just a stupid half-orc. Maybe there's more to them. So they started becoming more friendly. Yes,
that was Anuki.
Yeah, it was Anuki. Yeah. You know, and in the end, they ended up going for like a side quest, where again it sort of strengthened that relationship more and more. But it was one thing that my character did that caused Anuki to be like, oh, I want to know more.
Chris, I'm guessing from the whole kind of improv background, this is just the most pure form of like yes-andism, right? Like, this is taking an idea and then building upon it and then just launching it back at the person who created it.
Yeah, pretty much. It's creating, I've said it before, I'll say it again, it's creating a story together. And when you're doing it and if it feels right, then it is right, and you just have to trust that. It's very hard to explain how that happens, but you start to get a feel for when characters need to talk to each other, or if you have a curiosity in your brain about what's going on, then you can just have a nice conversation about it. It's entirely possible. And choosing which characters, sometimes characters need talking to, sometimes a bit sternly, sometimes not.
I think generally if I'm picking a scene, it's usually because I want to highlight something in my character, but also it will highlight something in their character and in the other person's. So when those two things meet, I'm like, okay, I want to do a scene because it's going to be interesting for me and it's going to be interesting for you. And then if you get that win-win situation, that automatically creates like value, I find.
I mean, I guess, like the whole paladin rogue, paladin warlock dynamic.
Order versus chaos.
Yeah. And any of those kind of less than smooth relationships.
But you want, if you do have that dynamic, the paladin rogue, you want the interaction you have to be a positive one, right?
Yes.
You want it. That's what you really want.
Even if your characters are surprised that it's going to be a positive thing. But I guess that also comes down to having a discussion with your players and cool role play. Like, I think everyone appreciates cool role play, even if they pretend they don't. That's my assumption. But sometimes it's good to just give the other person a heads up that it's coming their way.
Just good table etiquette.
Yeah, just even like if it's a quick message or a quick word before things kick off, and just say, "Hey, like at some point, can we do this?" That's all it needs to be.
It's like, can we do a bit? Can we do a sketch? Yeah.
But also, you gotta make sure, especially if you're those two sort of diametrically opposed, you avoid those. But that's what my character would do moments as well, because again, as long as you have that conversation before it happens, because you don't want to be the paladin and then the rogue just suddenly kills someone.
Yeah, I mean, all of these are opportunities for you and the other person to grow, like to develop your characters. I mean, I pulled a face earlier because I know that Sprock has been spoken to a couple of times since we arrived in the Feywild. it's a weird one because actually those conversations aren't friendly from Sprock's side of the fence.
Are
Anyway,
you a troublemaker, Dan?
Sprock is definitely a troublemaker. I am pure-hearted and innocent to my core,
Okay.
but even though Sprock is gonna replied with this miserly old goblin has replied with snarls and snorts and dismissal, I'd like to hope that the idea that it's starting, like the hard outer shell is starting to crack and begin to soft boil and fall away. Yeah, I'm really thankful that people are like Sophie, Huck, bless him, this poor little Harangun paladin, kind of reaching out with a heart of gold to this git, this grumpy old shriveled up git. I really appreciate those because without those, arguably, I just have to kind of rug pull Sprock's personality at some point down the road, and there won't be a satisfying development. Like there won't be a journey. If that makes sense.
It's I don't mean to add to it, but like it's going to be interesting when that happens for my character because it's I'm playing it as if I'm used to this behavior.
Yes.
It's a known behavior, and one which I like doesn't really surprise me as a character. It's just normal. But there is some things that maybe I don't know how much Dan knows that's gone on inside my head. So there is some stuff that I might know as my character that Dan doesn't know, and there might be some surprises, and there might not be. I don't know. Yeah, it's a really curious thing as to how much you let go and how much you hold on to help that development.
Well, it's good. Like when you're developing those sort of, once you've found a player that you can and developing those relationships, sometimes you do. Well, depends on the relationship between the characters. And if I use like pop culture, if you think about The Expanse, everyone was friendly enough with each other on the Kant before they joined like the crew of the Rocinante, but everyone had secrets and everything, but they knew each other. And then obviously those extra secrets were fundamentally the role play opportunities, and it's like you learned a little something about Naomi, and suddenly it was like, it's using that as the example that you can either let everyone know everything about your character and be uncomplicated, or you could have those really cool bits. So the relationship between Gil and Sprock, you may have told him everything. You may have not, because sometimes you may even want Sprock to be surprised. But that's what's really cool about forging those relationships, because even Dan, who's like, "Oh, I know everything," or his character, "I know everything," and then suddenly you drop that bombshell, it's like, "Thought we were friends." It influences a whole new roleplay opportunity, and that's what I like about doing that, about those pre-prep relationship forging. But I'd also love it in game when you're forging those things through roleplay, when there's that big moment that binds these two characters together, and then you start having those conversations that you didn't have at the beginning. I know me and Matt have been talking a bit because of something that Zumbo did in EOE has pushed Katya to join him, and I want to sort of now work with Matt to try and expand on these sort of story points, because one thing brought them together in a story moment, and my character's latched onto that, to phrase herself, like a dog with a bone, and she's not going to want to let it go.
Nate, as a relatively kind of new to 5th edition, like
really new to D&D, pretty
really new to D&D, but like, have you found at the Witchlight table we've kind of gone around the houses and kind of discussed how the 5 characters might kind of know each other and how they might intermingle and interact, but like what sort of benefits have you kind of experienced off the back of that from a role play or a gameplay perspective?
I mean, with the game that we're playing at the moment, I do kind of feel like I've taken like a little bit of a backseat, and that's purely because I'm just like a little bit like, oh, I just want to see how other people do it, which has been really good and really beneficial for me. But I kind of feel like now I'm starting to let myself go a little bit, and I am actually starting to sort of interact. So I think not really sort of pushing people to kind of go like, you have a conversation with this character and you're gonna forge loving friendships that will last forever and ever. I think just letting people sort of have that time to sort of get into their character and learn a little bit more about them, and just sort of learn about the other sort of characters that are happening. I mean, luckily with Heffy, she's very much someone who does kind of take kind of a back seat, but also kind of plays on that whole fact that she's just a dithering old lady when really she isn't, and will just listen to what everyone else is saying. And it's been really nice that I haven't been like just sort of forced more into the sort of role play and just to go at my own pace and just kind of learn then sort of like, okay, how can my character more interact? And also with like the group we have is just really great, especially Dan. We have another Dan in our game as well.
Not you, Dan. You're not
No.
great.
I'm a right arsehole.
But I'll mention this in a moment. But Dan is like, he's really, his character Luminous is really lovely just to get, he interacts with the other characters and he asks them about their viewpoints and things like that. Obviously that's not going to be in Sprock's character because Sprock doesn't give a damn about what anyone else thinks. Gil is very much like, they are wanting to kind of just like, I'm just going with the flow, and Huck is still like, I'm a little bit nervous about everything, and Heavy just goes with it. So Luminous is like a really good character to actually just engage with the other characters and ask them, well, how are you feeling about this? How are you feeling like this? And Dan plays that really well, and gets those people, especially myself, who might be a little bit too nervous to sort of jump into the conversation, to actually sort of open up and gives like a little bit of the floor to them. I actually find with my conversation that I actually speak to Julie a lot more. I generally find my character speaks a lot more to the NPCs than the rest of the characters.
Well, I mean, still, we was discussing in our last session that we kind of collectively see Heffy as like the loving, caring mother of the group, like the mother hen that we all crowd round for safety.
But I mean, going back to your character Sprock, I mean, all of our characters, even Gil to a sense, they're incredibly positive. They're just like, you know, we're on this adventure, we're going to find the things that we've lost, and despite the sort of trials and tribulations that may come ahead of them, they're like ready to go. And then just having that big crowd of people, these 4 people who are relatively like, let's just go for it. And then there's Sprock, this tiny little ball of negativity, who's just like, who are these bellends that I just happen to be with? I think is actually like a really nice juxtaposition between the lot. And you can now see in the characters as they're developing, Brock is now getting like a little bit worn away by that positivity. And
all the sharp edges are getting chamfered off.
Yeah. And I loved it in our last game when, obviously, because Gil and Sprock have spent so much time together as like carnival workers, that you've started using a new skill. You've started using a new magic spell, which is hopefully going to get us through the next part of our game, which Sprock knew nothing about. And that whole bit that you played out with you just dressed up as a different, like just an NPC tavern person, and Sprock just being like a little bit like, what? It was really, really funny.
Yeah.
Just using disguised self to mess with my fellow character.
Very
But
good.
didn't know I could do it because technically my character didn't know that they could do it. They thought they could, but wasn't sure.
So, from what I can tell, everyone kind of likes it happening more naturally in the game. How do you feel then on those few RPGs? Like, I can think of like 2 immediate, like a superhero one and a sort of more light-hearted one, that usually try to slam you together to begin with. Like, you have a superhero base, or you have a tree house or a hideout. How do you feel about those ones that try to shoehorn you into the social interaction by saying, you know, you start in this place, you talk in this place, you know each other because of this place? Like,
That's fine. Here's the thing. Just because you work together and live in the same place doesn't mean you like each other, right?
Yeah.
So it's from there, the ground is open for you
or
to
actually know each other outside of work. Like, it's amazing that the superhero community happens to know everyone else's alter egos. Like, that's just terrible data protection breaches right there. That's
GDPR would have a field day.
right. Like, oh yeah, Bruce Wayne. Oh, I know where he lives.
If you've got like a one shot and people are playing quite like strong stereotypes in a way. Like they're playing characters that people would know. Like one is the grumpy one is the hyperactive one, and so forth. I think then people can quickly gauge those sorts of relationships that you'd have. And like with going back to the horror movie game that we played with Chris, like we had tropes already. So we had one who was the protagonist male who was trying to win the girl. We had the young mischievous boy. We had the teenage, like, sort of cheerleader. We had the hillbilly that lived in a junkyard with his big dog. And then you had me, who played like a youth pastor. So you know that I'm going to be very Jesus preachy, but I'm not going to be very confident about it. And if people have those sort of ideas of like, that's the character, we've seen this before over and over again in like other things, we now have an idea of how our character is going to interact with them. So that can work in that one shot. I think with those characters, if it was longer, I think that would get a little bit boring for everyone. And that's, I think, why you need like a few more sessions, especially like in D&D, when you want more complex characters. That helps when that sort of carries on for a long time. But for a one shot, if people know like a trope or a stereotype of a certain character, then I think that's quite easy to meld quite quickly.
I mean, something that, like, in the idea of, especially if it's a relatively quick start game, I always find that, like, a fiasco style setup where everyone says how their character knows the character to their left.
Yeah.
Like, what job did you do together and why did it go wrong? And sometimes that will get prompted by the GM, but through that, you just kind of build this interlinking network. And then sometimes that's just the stepping stone that you need to kickstart everything else, right? Like, and kind of develop the more complex themes.
Well, with that, I think we've established the many different ways you can forge these character relationships, be it forced into it at the start, or very careful consideration at your session 0, or through big events that happened during roleplay. But however you basically forge your relationships, maybe leave a comment down below to let us know maybe some of your favourite ones. While you're down there, also make sure you hit the like, the subscribe button as well, as it really does help us out. With that, we're going to move on to the DM's table. Thanks for watching. We release segments like this from the Tavern Between Dimensions every Friday here on the Explorers of Elsewhere channel. Otherwise, if you want to listen to the episode in full, you can check us out on Spotify and Amazon Music.